All right. Welcome to Real Queer America, a reading and retrospective featuring gender studies scholar and GLAAD award-winning journalist Samantha Allen. My name is Lauren Gilmet. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an assistant professor of philosophy at Elon University, where I also teach women's gender and sexuality studies. I'm proud to be moderating this event alongside one of my undergraduate WGSS minors, should be a major, maybe soon, minors, Billy Waller. Billy is currently a sophomore at Elon University, where he is known to say that he is majoring in cinema and TV, but he may just accidentally also earn a BA in philosophy, since he is currently taking my senior seminar on Foucault, in addition to his minor in women's gender and sexuality studies. He is currently TLA for my 10:30 a.m. section of WGS 110, Sex and Gender. Hello to our students who are currently listening to this webinar. We look forward to hearing questions from you. Hi, Billy.
Hi, so yeah, I'm Billy. I use he, him pronouns. I identify as trans, masc, and queer. I also do some work with Libby in the library with the zine archive at Elon, which is some more work that I enjoy doing. So yeah, thank you for the introduction.
And Libby Coiner and Shepard Sosi over on the other side. So Libby and Sos are going to be carefully watching the Q&A just in case we get carried away and I don't notice your questions. But I also look forward to their questions as well. Libby and Sos, hello. Okay, so thanks to Elon University and especially to Elon's program in women's gender and sexuality studies for hosting this event, along with our co-sponsors, the GLC and the Peace and Conflict Studies program. A big thanks as well to Elon Media Services for their support in helping me to host this webinar. I'd like to begin with a moment of silence in honor of a mutual friend of Samantha's and mine who passed away suddenly this year, someone dear to many of us in our world at Emory, and also to people at Duke once she started in grad school there. Nobody would have been more excited for this webinar right now than Alexa Koukopoulos. And Alexa would have been 26 in May, and we miss her dearly and often. Samantha Allen is a GLAAD award-winning journalist, previously a senior reporter at the Daily Beast covering LGBT issues, as well as a sex and life staff writer for Fusion. She has been published widely by outlets including the New York Times, CNN, Rolling Stone, and Out Magazine. And she has appeared to discuss her reporting on MSNBC, CNN, C-SPAN's Book TV, and NPR's On the Media. Her scholarly work has been published in Feminist Theory and Loading, the Journal of the Canadian Games Studies Association. In addition to the book she will be discussing today, Real Queer America, Samantha Allen is most recently the author of M2WTF, a humorous retelling of her gender transition in audio form, released this year through Audible Originals. She is also author of the animated ebook Love and Estrogen in 2018, which tells the unforgettable story of meeting her wife, Corey, in a Kinsey Institute elevator. As Samantha succinctly puts it, a real-life queer rom-com. While not working on her next book, Samantha co-hosts the You Should See the Other Guy podcast and writes a newsletter called Get Lost. She is an alpaca enthusiast, and her love of The Bachelor knows no bounds. Samantha holds a PhD in women's gender and sexuality studies from Emory University with a graduate certificate in psychoanalytic studies. I'm lucky to have known her since we were both at Emory, writing our dissertations on affect in feminist and queer theory in Atlanta. This weekend, in preparation for this event, I went back to reread the nomination I wrote for Samantha for the Unsung Heroine Award from Emory's Center for Women in January of 2014. First, when rereading this nomination, I cringe at the corniness of my own writing, proclaiming her grace in the face of adversity, which was cheesy, but not false. And when I get over myself, I'm wowed at the content of this letter, at Samantha's list of public scholarship in venues such as Jacobin, while still only a fourth-year graduate student. That list is just exponentially larger now, half a decade later. Today, Samantha will reflect on the changing landscape of LGBTQ rights since the publication of her book, Real Queer America, LGBT Stories from Red States, published in 2019 by Little Brown. A Lambda Literary Award finalist, Real Queer America is a travelogue around the US in the summer of 2017 in the wake of Donald Trump's election as president. The New York Times Book Review described it as, quote, a powerful book of memoir and reportage, end quote, while the LA Times called it, quote, a book necessary for anyone in or allied with the queer community, end quote. Over the course of her book, Samantha Allen spends time with LGBT Mormons in Utah who work to change the policies of their religion from within. She spends time at the Texas State Capitol with activists resisting Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick's relentless crusade for a transphobic bathroom bill. And in the wake of the neo-Nazi and white supremacist rally in Charlottesville that summer, she visits her queer chosen family in Johnson City, Tennessee, and ventures with them to Dollywood, among other stops along the way. I'm going to go ahead and post a link momentarily to the new paperbook edition of Real Queer America in the webinar chat for those who might be interested in ordering a copy. You can get it in paperback now. My two sections of Women's and Gender Studies 110 just finished reading the book as part of our course, and the text has generated for us many rich conversations about building queer community in our own relatively conservative Alamance County. And in addition, so I'll post that link once I stop talking, just one second. And then in addition to speaking about her book, Samantha has agreed to read a portion from her 5th chapter, Not the Family That You're In, which records her time in Johnson City, which is really near the border of North Carolina. All right, let's welcome Samantha Allen to Elon. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Lauren, and thank you to Elon's WTSS program, to the Gender and LGBTQIA Center, to Peace and Conflict Studies. It's very generous of you to have me, and thank you for honoring Alexa as you did. You know, Alexa admired my writing in a way that I always felt uncomfortable with, because having read her writing at Emory, it was just so beautiful and resplendent and sharp, and I wish the world had gotten to read more of it. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you here, to revisit the book the year after it came out, but also kind of 4 years after it was born. And I think fitting, given our tribute, to be reading a short passage on queer friendship from the Johnson City, Tennessee chapter. And then I'll talk a little bit about the book, and then we'll move into like some questions, which is the part I'm really excited about. So this is from Not the Family That You're In. It's sort of 2/3 of the way through my road trip. And yeah, I'll start with, I'll start here. We have a routine every time I come into town, and the night of August 3rd, 2017 is no different. First, we greet the animals. Doc, an affection-hungry German shepherd who has no idea how enormous he is. His more docile female counterpart, Red, and a tiny terrier mix named Lily, whom Justin found abandoned in the middle of the night, shivering in a cold corner of the nearby dog park. Last but not least, we say hello to Zelda, an energetic red-footed tortoise whose homemade and artificially humidified wooden habitat has a rainbow pride flag for a backdrop. My road trip buddy Billy falls in love with Zelly, as he calls her, at first sight, tenderly brushing the top of her scaly head with his index finger. Then we head straight over to an all-night diner called Mid-City Grill to share a place of house-cut bacon cheese fries with a big side of drippy ranch, washing it all down with a 6-pack of Yeehaw beer brewed right across the street. Out of all the places to eat in Johnson City's 1920s style downtown, sometimes referred to as Little Chicago, this BYOB joint is undeniably the best. The food here doesn't have to be good. Many of the people eating it are either drunk or rapidly on their way to being drunk, but it is. My favorite burger, the heater, is topped with pickled jalapenos that have been marinated in sriracha. It is sinfully scrumptious. After sustenance, it's back to the house for video games, Resident Evil 7 this time around, with a side of homemade bourbon slushies. Justin has always been cagey about the ingredients in this beverage, but I've managed to piece most of the recipe together by now. Jim Beam bourbon, Earl Grey iced tea, San Pellegrino blood orange soda, and one final, still mysterious ingredient. Before we get too tipsy though, we receive a visit from Jen's brother Joe, an illustrator who worked as an international male model for several years after Jen submitted his headshot to an agency as a joke. and Joe's equally photogenic wife, Hannah, who commandeers the Xbox controller and begins shooting zombies in the head with a terrifying degree of precision. At some point in the night, Joe and Hannah head home, Resident Evil gets swapped out for a movie, and we start dozing off, some of us on the couch in a pile of dogs, others upstairs on beds. The dogs will need to be walked in the morning out to the sinkhole in the stalled housing development half a mile from here. But for now, I am full and happy, drunk and loved. I stumble upstairs to my air mattress and sleep better than I have in weeks. Queerness is as much about friendship as it is about sex. In his 2005 book, In a Queer Time and Place, cultural theorist Jack Halberstam wrote that we should try to, quote, detach queerness from sexual identity and pay attention to queer friendships and queer networks instead. That might seem like a radical notion at first. After all, the fact that I have sex with another woman seems to be a big part of what makes me queer in society's eyes. But most of my life takes place outside the bedroom, and my queerness seems to come with me wherever I go. As Halberstam argued, what makes queer people, quote, a perceived menace to the institutions of family, heterosexuality, and reproduction has at least as much to do with the unusual ways in which we connect to each other as it does with the actual Leviticus band intercourse itself. My queerness doesn't exclusively stem from my relationship with my wife. It is also an alternate way of existing in the world that has improbably allowed me to acquire a second family in an overlooked corner of Tennessee. So if you want to understand LGBT life in America, you need to know something about queer friendship. Halberstam's 2005 argument drew from an influential 1981 interview given by the gay French philosopher Michel Foucault, published under the title Friendship is a Way of Life, in which the thinker argued that it is the, quote, homosexual mode of life that makes homosexuality disturbing to the world, much more than the sexual act itself. When I first read that interview back in graduate school, younger and spunkier than I am today, I didn't understand Foucault's point. What makes an entire way of life homosexual or queer? Wasn't queerness itself about forbidden sexual desire? Nope, at least not for Foucault. Foucault warned that when we hypersexualize homosexuality, when we think about it as, quote, two young men meeting in the street, seducing each other with a look, grabbing each other's asses and getting each other off in a quarter of an hour, we gloss over everything else that can be troubling to a sanitized heteronormative world about affection, tenderness, friendship, fidelity, camaraderie, and companionship. What about the intense relationships, the philosopher wondered, between young men in the military? What about female friendships in the United States, he observed, in which women do each other's hair, help each other with makeup, dress each other, put their arms around each other, and kiss each other? Friendships much like the one I share with Jennifer Culp. To imagine a sexual act that doesn't conform to law or nature is not what disturbs people, Foucault insisted, but that individuals are beginning to love one another. There's the problem. The kind of category-defying love Foucault describes is a problem only because love is supposed to stay inside the proper social channels in our heteronormative culture. The family you're born into is the family you're supposed to be content with, and we are told repeatedly without any explanation or supporting evidence that we are meant to love them no matter what. To fit into such a culture, your friendships ought to be lesser bonds than your familial ties, which in turn are second only to the sexual contract you share with your spouse. Probe that unspoken ranking too insistently, and you will receive only tautologies in return. Because they're your family, or because he's your husband, that's why. But when you're queer, you learn how arbitrary that way of looking at the world can be. The people with whom you grew up can become strangers in a single heartbreaking instant. You discover as a queer person that there's nothing stopping you from imbuing your friendships with the same meaning that most people attach to their familial relationships. You stop looking for the truth about your identity and your sexuality, and instead, as Foucault advised, use your sexuality henceforth to arrive at a multiplicity of relationships. This is what has happened to me since coming out as queer and transgender. The heady feeling of finally being myself and loving who I want to love didn't last forever. What has sustained me in the long run is the deep ties that I've built with friends. A woman like Jen didn't just start to feel like a sister to me. She was transformed through some kind of queer alchemy into an actual sister. Sorry, I think my cat is shaking herself in the background. And I love her now with what Foucault would call a dense, bright, marvelous love. A love so strong that it refuses the binary checkboxes of friendship and attraction to become simply and indescribably its own thing. This is a section I'm gonna read for today. Thanks for listening, bearing with me. And yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the book. So the idea for the book arose in the aftermath of the 2016 election when, okay, this is hilarious to me. She's new, we got her a month ago. She is doing the thing where she paused at the side of her litter box to get her scent into the litter box. So important developmental things happening for Miss Zuma behind me in this box we can see right
What's
here.
her name? Say it again.
Zuma, Z-U-M-A. She is a hairless Sphinx cat, and this is her fourth week here, and she's a very good cat. She should be on her way out now, but I'll carry on. So yeah, this kind of came about in 2016 when I was encountering what I think was some almost apocalyptic sentiment among friends I had who were living on the coast at that time about what queer life would look like in the future. And that was a concern that I definitely shared. I don't think anyone looking at, Trump's cabinet and advisors could afford not to be concerned about that. But also, my entire queer adult life had taken place against this red state backdrop. So I knew how resilient the LGBTQ community could be, even in incredibly dire circumstances. And perhaps especially in those dire circumstances, as one of the interviewees for my book told me, it became kind of a thesis of the project, oppression and opposition can build the most beautiful connections. And there are ways in which my coming out story felt almost like it was engineered to drill that point into my head over and over again. Lauren, you and I attended Emory together. I was there from 2010 to 2015, and I came out in 2012. And I was coming out as a transgender woman, in 2012, but also like during my first 3 years of living in the American South. I grew up in California and New Jersey. So to do that, I had to kind of confront and overcome all of these preconceptions and assumptions that I had about inclusivity and acceptance in the South. Because at first I thought, oh, there's no way I can come out here. Atlanta's okay. And maybe like this grad school atmosphere is pretty queer friendly, but what's it like out there? And when you grow up on the West Coast and in the Northeast, you get a really, I think, tainted vision of what the South is like. You have to overcome this inner voice that expects everyone to just be homophobic and transphobic. And as it turned out, it felt totally different to come out into Atlanta, which is just such an energizing place to be queer. I think it's like some of the most amazing and impressive queer advocacy in the country is happening in Atlanta. There's a world-renowned hormone specialist in transgender therapy practicing at Emory. There was a large transgender conference at the time called Southern Comfort that came to town every year and filled up the lobby of a hotel just across the perimeter with trans people of all ages who were holding educational workshops and doing karaoke. And I found discussion groups, supportive doctors, close friends, advocacy groups, all of whom helped me through transition in the South. The next year, of course, on a summer research trip to the Kinsey Institute in Bloomington, Indiana, I met my wife, Corey, in an elevator. Anyone who's been to the Kinsey Institute knows this is like in a building, old building. The elevator is like really tiny. If you get in at the same time, you basically have to talk to each other. So I went to Bloomington, Indiana alone, 6 months into my gender transition, not knowing anyone, thinking I'm going to spend the summer in Indiana. What's that going to look like? And I came home with the person who turned out to be my life partner, and of course had all these amazing experiences in Bloomington at the Backdoor nightclub, which is this really radical, cool queer nightclub, and all kinds of cool stuff. I'm breezing through because I'm trying to get to the meatier portion of this before our Q&A. But even, you know, after Atlanta and Bloomington, you know, I think there was still some little nagging piece of my brain that thought I was just getting lucky, that like maybe I was just randomly stumbling across, you know, places in more conservative parts of the country that had amazing, vibrant LGBTQ advocacy. But then, you know, I got invited by a friend to go see her in Johnson City, Tennessee, which is close to you all. It's, you know, this little town nestled in the mountains, the Smokies. And this is an excerpt that I read for you. And gosh, you know, at that point, I feel like the point had been made, because we had just a blast, and we went out to the gay nightclub on the edge of town. It's called New Beginnings, or Newbies for short. And like, I had three, you know, it takes three sometimes to notice a pattern. And I was like, hey, actually LGBTQ advocacy and community looks really vibrant in red states, perhaps because people feel especially like you have to band together as a community in places where you're more likely to face hostile legislation or homophobic or transphobic judges or policies or that kind of thing. So those were the kinds of experiences that I was carrying with me at the time of the 2016 election. You know, I'd seen firsthand and benefited from this groundswell of LGBTQ activism and advocacy in states where people weren't expecting that to be happening, and places that were still being stereotyped as flyover country. I had started a career as a reporter too, so I was, you know, in my personal experience was kind of being braided in with some of the reporting I was doing. You know, over 180 cities and counties in states that went red in 2016 have fully inclusive anti-LGBTQ non-discrimination ordinances. So like, I think people still think of red states as this block when it comes to queer issues, and not as places that are just absolutely riddled with little oases where people are getting, you know, LGBTQ protections passed at this really remarkable rate. And while I knew that state level laws weren't changing as fast as people would like, I knew from my experience, from my reporting work, that there was this intractable change happening within people's friend groups, within families, within faith communities, and that there was going to be no way to reverse that process, no matter what happened in the federal government. Because once people open their hearts to LGBTQ loved ones, it's very hard to close them again. So the more I was thinking about things in the aftermath of 2016, the more I actually felt optimistic about the future of LGBTQ life in this country. I knew that the next 4 years at least were going to be dicey, but I also knew from meeting, you know, queer kids in rural Georgia and going to drag shows in South Central Indiana that the Rubicon had kind of been crossed, and that there was going to be no stopping really what happened next. But that put me in this odd position of wanting to write a very hopeful book at a time when people were not feeling hopeful. You know, I was a full-time journalist covering LGBTQ stories for the Daily Beast, and to me, it felt like there were only two kinds of stories that liberal readers wanted to hear about LGBTQ life in red states. They either wanted to hear the very individualistic, you know, American narrative of individual triumphing over their circumstances, like the gay prom king at a North Carolina high school or something like that. Or they wanted to hear about the terrible anti-LGBTQ bill. They want to hear, oh, North Carolina passed an anti-transgender bill. People click on that a lot. And I think both of those stories kind of come from the same place. They come from the assumption that states like North Carolina are bad places to be LGBTQ. You know, one kind of story, that individual triumph story, interrupts that assumption, but only for a moment, and it gets its force because of that assumption. And the other kind of story, like the bathroom bill story, shores up that negative assumption about North Carolina and leaves readers in other media markets sort of assured of their own moral superiority, assured that they should still consider most of the surface area of their country to be flyover country. And neither of those stories that, you know, were being produced at this national level, I thought was fair to the rich fabric of queer life in the middle of this country. And I think that's what's exactly what was getting missed, the texture of queer life, the actual facts of LGBTQ accomplishment in more conservative spaces. So that's what I wanted to set out to capture on the road trip, which happened in the summer of 2017. There's this famous quote that journalism is the rough draft of history. And it sounds cool because it makes you feel like, oh, I'm getting to write history as it happens. But it's also scary because it means that you're gambling. You're gambling that your account of history is going to prove to be the right one, or at least close enough to the right one that it's going to be lasting and have credibility in some way. So I felt like there was always this risk that Real Queer America was going to be this weird blip of optimism right before, you know, something terrible and cataclysmic. And Real Queer America was also, you know, journalism informed by queer theory. So it was sort of this double gamble, because theory is essentially a set of hypotheses about experience, about society, that aren't necessarily provable in some strict mathematical sense, which means we only can measure their success by their explanatory power. So I was nervous, not that I was just being too optimistic about where LGBTQ life was headed, but also that my application of like queer theory to red state queer life might not resonate. You know, I was taking these thinkers who I had up to that point exclusively read in a very privileged academic setting, you know, Emory's full of marble buildings and columns and stuff, and applying that work to things like queer friendship in Tennessee or queer world making in Indiana. So that made the experience of actually writing this book really feel deeply speculative, like I was walking out on a long tree limb. You know, I was a young reporter. I had been given a very modest book advance, going on this 2-month-long road trip, spending honestly much of my advance on hotels and rental cars, hoping that I was going to be able to pull something cohesive out of this trip at the end. But as many of you have read in the book, it did end up being a life-changing experience. And if I think I had to sum up what I learned from it, it's this: queerness isn't an aesthetic or merely kind of a basket full of identities. It's a way of life, or at least a way of approaching life that cuts against prevailing norms. You know, I interviewed over 36 people for the book of all sorts of identities and ages across 8 states, and very different life experiences, but what they had in common was this sort of core commitment to the humanity of the misunderstood and a desire to chart a life sort of unbothered by anti-LGBTQ strictures. Most had assembled informal modes of kinship, what we call chosen family, and they were able to sort of draw from deep wells of joy with each other, even in the most unforgiving and inhospitable places. Queerness is famously slippery to define, but it's also defined by its slipperiness. So you always just kind of feel like you're circling around it. But the essence of it, I think, is that it's a mode of life that is, Eve Sedgwick famously suggested in her definition, cuts across received understandings of what a straight world thinks life should look like. And that's what I observed in every state I visited and every cluster of interviewees. And I think that's what I hope can be the sort of long-term takeaway of Real Queer America. I think we live in a time when there have been these tremendous inroads made in LGBTQ representation in media, but I think queerness now is presented to us on TV and in films as being just hyper aestheticized and hyper stylized. It's still most often shown to us against a very glossy urban backdrop, like in the L Word reboot, or in a historical one, focusing on things like Stonewall or Harvey Milk. It sort of almost feels to me like the media is circling around what it would be like to depict what life is like for almost half of the queer community in this country today. Like, it feels like it either has to be Los Angeles now or San Francisco in 1978. Like, the thought of doing Iowa in 2020 is just escapes people's minds. So while I think that this kind of explosion of LGBTQ media representation is a really positive development, I think it can still be isolating, and that it misses the quotidian experience of so many queer folks today. You know, if you're a queer girl living in small town Tennessee, you might find the L word to be about as relevant to your experience as Sex in the City was, you know, which is to say not very much. And I wanted to write Real Queer America is one of the books that could help sort of fill that gap. Because, you know, this won't be surprising to many of you, but like readers of the book continue to be shocked to learn just how many queer people live in the South. You know, and I think queer folks in conservative areas of the country are still getting the message from that media representation loud and clear that the coolest, most desirable places to be LGBTQ are these coastal mega metropolises. You know, I remember writing the book, hanging out with young queer kids in Provo, Utah, who were growing up in supportive households, and they were just odd that I had been to New York for work, and they were just like, oh, I want to go there after I graduate. And I remember thinking, gosh, I hope you don't go to New York, because the New York you're seeing on TV is very different from the one in real life, where the apartments are a lot smaller and the rats are more plentiful. And I wanted to let them know that they could be queer anywhere. So at a time when I think a lot of young LGBTQ people are still getting the message that to be queer, you need to move to Los Angeles, get an undercut, and start doing yoga, I wanted to leave behind a book that would say something different. You know, be queer where you are if you want to. Queerness doesn't depend on your geography. You can be a fly fisherman in Wyoming, and it wouldn't make you any less queer, because it's a way of life. And I think that's a project that continues with anyone who reads the book, and anyone who's been, you know, living this life long before I stumbled across it. What I've been most gratified by since writing it is that when people sort of publicly assume that queer people don't live in red states, or hate living in red states, or don't build lasting community there, there's now this, I think, fairly accessible, I hope, text that people can point to and say, hey, maybe you should read that book. And when I see that play out on social media, it makes all of those motel breakfasts and the large fraction of my book advance spent on the road trip very much worth it. But, you know, Real Queer America isn't and was never meant to be the sort of be all end all statement on that subject. It was meant to just kind of serve as a stake in the sand, something that people could gesture toward as we continue to demand and advocate for a more holistic and a more accurate view of contemporary queer life in this country. Because I think we still think of LGBTQ stories that take place in red states as an exception to a rule, as tales of survival and hope that take place against harsh landscapes, when in fact they're more ordinary and should honestly rightly be about half of the queer stories that we see. Lauren, how are we on time? I have a little more I could say, or if we're eager to jump into questions.
I'm really enjoying listening to you. I'd love to hear a little more.
Okay, sure. The other thing I wanted to reflect on is how the optimism of Real Queer America might feel at a very challenging moment like 2020. Does that hold up?
And Samantha, that was a question that my students asked today. How does Samantha Allen stay optimistic in 2020? Literally. So yes, please.
Well, it's easy. First step, I ignore everything that's happening. No, I have a real answer to that later. But yeah, the question of optimism is a really interesting one at the heart of queer theory too, where there's this tension between writers like the late Jose Esteban Munoz, who sort of saw a utopian vision at the heart of queerness, and writers like Lee Edelman and others who were more invested in what's called the antisocial turn, who, to give it a really short gloss, takes kind of a more pessimistic view, rejecting the association of queerness and futurity and saying that's where radical potential lies. And there's also this really long-standing criticism in queer theory of placing too much value in these sort of tentpole political achievements like same-sex marriage as being barometers of actual progress that mean anything. So the question of optimism is an interesting one because I think any time you try to measure whether queer life in this country is getting better or not, it's always going to be kind of a fraught question from the start, intellectually speaking, depending on, you know, what kind of theoretical framework you're taking to it. But for me, I think back to that apocalyptic sentiment in which Real Queer America was sort of born as a reaction. And I feel like I can say that that sentiment was in part the result of an overestimation of how much something like the White House actually matters in the overall pace of queer acceptance. So clearly, different administrations can cause material harm or benefit to the LGBTQ community. We've seen that firsthand with policies like the trans military ban. I'm not diminishing that at all, but I think there's a sense in which what happens in DC can be a distraction from an overall queering of the country that's been happening at its own steady pace. So I think while you can point to things like the Obergefell marriage decision in 2015 and say, look, you know, the federal government pushed things forward, they moved the needle forward. In actuality, I think a ruling like Obergefell or the more recent employment protection decision we got over the summer are actually kind of just the long delayed consequence of this more kind of subterranean change that's impossible to trace fully because it's literally just happening in conversations between parents and kids, between coworkers, between pastors and their congregants. I mean, the number of parents I met writing this book who had, you know, their kid came out to them when they were 12 and, you know, overnight the parent had become an expert in LGBTQ issues that they had never read about before. Like, that's a major engine for social change in this country right now. So I don't want to bore you with a bunch of statistics, but we can see really steadily that the percentages of people who know an LGBTQ person and the percentages who say that they support LGBTQ rights just rising in tandem in a relatively steady upward slope. So presidents will come and go. The composition of the Supreme Court is going to keep changing. Certain aspects of LGBTQ life are always going to be swinging back and forth like this wrecking ball. But I think that slow, steady process of people getting acquainted with LGBTQ neighbors, family members, et cetera, that's been happening for 40 some years now. And I don't think you can really throw a wrench in that, which is why, you know, in 2020, in a very anxious and scary political place, I'm still confident. I think that the overall optimism of the book will hold up. You know, we're still seeing conversion therapy getting banned. We're still seeing these non-discrimination ordinances getting passed. We're seeing really difficult but important conversations happening about LGBTQ acceptance in the Methodist Church, starting in the Catholic Church, happening in Mormonism, as more and more people in faith groups agitate for change. And I think really egregious anti-LGBTQ legislation is starting to die more often in state legislatures sooner than it usually would. So I think, you know, even in this 4-year stretch that we thought might take us back to the Stone Age, there's been all of this progress, even amid the kind of more nightmarish federal policies. And so I think that there's this massive but more challenging to define process underway that, you know, it's like a boulder rolling down a mountain. It's really radical, but it's also untraumatic. It's something that's happening around dinner tables, you know, which is not where we're used to seeing queer progress happening. And I think to kind of wrap things up, that's what was really refreshing to me about getting the opportunity to write this book coming out of graduate school. I mean, you know, Lauren, coming from academia, having read and studied the amount of queer theory we have, there are all these books that seem like to just want to reach toward the ends, towards some kind of big grand answer, like the end of Gender Trouble spends, you know, 10 chapters diagnosing society's heteronormativity. And then at the end, there's a chapter where it's like, maybe drag can do something. Maybe drag shows will disrupt everything and reveal gender's performance. And that felt like a pattern to me in a lot of queer theoretical texts of being really great at diagnosing society's heteronormativity and then just kind of throwing this Hail Mary pass at the end toward imagining what it would look like to disrupt it. And I think I got the just enormous chance that I'll forever be grateful for, to actually get up close and see that changes to heteronormative life are happening, not just as some kind of theoretical project, but just as a lived reality. You know, if journalism is the retroactive history and theory is a hypothesis about life, then I just feel enormously humbled to have gotten this glimpse at the beauty and wonder of queer change in this country as it happens. And I'm grateful if even a bit of it has resonated with you all listening. So those are some of my reflections on the book a year later. Sorry if they were more than you wanted to hear, but this is the part I'm excited about, is talking with you all.
Absolutely. Samantha, thank you so much for sharing your reflections on your work. I know, so some of the people in attendance have read your book already. 65 of my introductory sex and gender students have read it, but there's some folks in the call who haven't, and so that background was really helpful. I want to let folks know that the way that the different tools in this tech setup work are right, the Q&A. So if you click on the Q&A, so if you look at the bottom panel underneath the four of us, you should see a Q&A button and then also a chat button. So the chat button is a great space to thank our speaker, to give encouraging comments during the talk, or just chime in and say, yeah, I like that. On the Q&A, that's where, if you want to ask a question to Samantha, please put your question there, and we will all be keeping an eye on it. And so we're now moving into the discussion portion. And so I have some questions that I've written. I have some questions from students. I have some questions. I know Billy has some questions. And so actually, Billy, would you like to ask the first question?
Sure, yeah. I'll start with, in chapter 4, you reference The Little Prince, which I love. And you reference it in which a fox tells the little boy, to you, I am nothing more than a fox like 100,000 other foxes. But if you tame me, then we shall need each other. To me, you will be unique in all the world. To you, I shall be unique in all the world. And you go on to explain that the fox understood that love is work, that we have agency to decide whether to invest our love in the people whose paths we cross. So how do you find yourself actively loving and choosing to love your transness and your queerness?
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting process and journey that, like, a lot of people are going on. You know, I think after I first came out as trans, I was so just concerned with the logistics of how this is happening, and you were running up against all of the structural and legal and medical obstacles that you face. And so it's hard to love that part of yourself, because it's the part of yourself that's responsible for a lot of nightmarish phone calls and doctor's appointments and uncomfortable interactions and harassment and all of this stuff. But I think you get power from loving and embracing that part of yourself. And I always feel very, like, new agey when I talk about that. Lauren, I'm sorry to keep bringing you back Foucault, but it's making me think about grad school. And when you and I were in grad school, I think I was a little more into the really like strong, like structuralist, like queer theory and like that kind of stuff. And I would read essays like Friendship is a Way of Life about, you know, like love being the thing that disrupts society, and be like, oh, Foucault was like feeling a little loopy that day or something. This is a little too touchy-feely for me. But I think just as I've lived more life, I've come to see like the wisdom and the beauty of that, of embracing your transness and your queerness in yourself, embracing it in your friends, and finding and embracing it in the places that you live in, and then making the places that you inhabit your own. So yeah, thank you for that really beautiful question, and long live the Little Prince.
Yeah. No, thank you for the response. I love talking to queer people about loving themselves, because I feel like that's the most important aspect of queerness, is like to find space to love yourself. So
yeah.
I have a lot more questions that Samantha's seen already. So, oh, look, there's some coming in the Q&A. Oh, well, I know this question has a little overlap with another of Billy's questions, but this is from an anonymous attendee. And so you're getting some feedback in the chat, just so you know, Samantha. always enjoy a little Prince reference and a Foucault reference. But so this question dovetails a bit with a question that I know Billy was going to ask as well, but this is an anonymous attendee. How do you see the pessimism emerging in response to the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett relating to and existing in comparison with the pessimism which emerged following the election of President Trump? Can we combat this pessimism in the same way, or does Coney Barrett's appointment speak to a different set of flaws in American culture? Great question.
Yeah, so I think we have a tendency to catastrophize about the Supreme Court, and I think like it could be a justifiable tendency as queer folks and marginalized communities to feel apocalyptic and catastrophic about it. When it comes to LGBTQ rights specifically, like, yes, I am worried about something happening to the Obergefell decision or to the more recent Bostock decision. There's a 6-3 conservative majority. Recently, 2 justices in a dissent signaled quite a bit of grumpiness, I think, about Obergefell, you know, signaling that they weren't quite over it, don't really consider it to be like binding super precedent in any way. So I think worry and anxiety is okay to feel, but I think if you want to feel some of that optimism, you've got to look toward what people are doing at a state and local level. So one example I'm pointing people to right now who are feeling really pessimistic is on the ballot in Nevada this year is an initiative to get Nevada's same-sex marriage ban, which is unconstitutional, formally retracted from the Constitution, so that even if the Supreme Court did something to Obergefell, Nevada's ban wouldn't be there in the Constitution, right? So we're seeing the first kind of inklings of states being like, we need to install some safeguards in the event of like LGBTQ nightmares at the Supreme Court level, because, you know, Obergefell happened, but most states in the United States still have same-sex marriage bans on their books. They were just invalidated by the Obergefell decision, right? So when you look at what's happening at local level, county level, state level, like it's undeniable to see this progress. So can the Supreme Court delay that, throw a wrench in it, make people's lives miserable for longer than they should be miserable? Absolutely. Do I think it changes the overall outcome? Not at all. Yeah.
Well, that's hopeful. Thank you. Billy, did you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, that answered one of my other questions, but I can ask another. Lauren had mentioned during class this morning that you've done work studying how video games allow trans people to explore their true selves. Especially true for me because I grew up designing male characters in the Lego Star Wars GameCube game, only to realize later in my teen years exactly why I was doing that. Can you speak a little bit to the reality of exploring identity and gender in a virtual safe space?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, I came out in 2012, which, you know, to a lot of my trans elders is still a very new and recent time when I had access to way more information than I did. But I still feel like even compared to people who are coming out now, I feel like I was sort of in the Stone Ages in terms of like ready access to reliable information about trans stuff. I don't think I knew until like late 2011 that you could like take hormones. Like I didn't know that that was part of a gender transition if you wanted it to be. Like that's the level of like, you know, lack of information I was dealing with. And so in that way, kind of like growing up from, you know, the late 80s to 2012, like what you have is this very inchoate feeling that you can't put words to. You know, I knew that something about boyhood and masculinity felt off to me. I would often say like to friends or even partners, like, I don't really feel like a man, but I didn't know that there was like an alternative and I didn't know what to do with these, you know, intense feelings of cross-gender identification that I had had since I was a child. And so the way that came out is like, you know, you gravitate toward fiction with female protagonists. When you're playing a video game and you can design your character, you design like the woman you wish you were, right? Or don't realize that you are yet. And so many trans people have stories like that about you have to kind of imagine what's possible for yourself in this realm where you don't even really fully understand what you're doing, and then you get access to the information and it unlocks like a lightning bolt. It's like the end of The Sixth Sense or something, where you realize not that Bruce Willis has been dead the whole time, but that like you were your true gender this whole time and just didn't know it yet. And all of these behaviors that you had, like always playing as the girl in role-playing games, for me, suddenly makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see, I have a few questions for you, but I also want to leave space for anyone else to jump in, because sometimes my students know I can dominate a conversation. So we got one from the audience, and I'd love to have us engage with this one, but everyone else is free to jump in. So based on your experiences in red states and rural areas, do you have any advice about coming out to conservative family and friends?
So my family is not a red state family, but I did grow up in a Mormon household, and my parents are still devout Mormons, although they've grown more liberal over the years. But coming out to them was harrowing, and I think the advice that I give to people, it's awkward advice to give, because I tell queer folks to be patient, and I know that sometimes that can come across as like, why should I do emotional labor for people who are making me feel uncomfortable or not accepted or that kind of thing. So I think you have to kind of use your own internal barometer with conservative family and friends, with maybe religious parents, as I did. And if someone feels like they're just flat out like, I'm never going to accept you, then yes, you would be wasting like effort to like really be that patient with it. And you do have to look out for your own emotional health and kind of like know when you need to take space or distance from people. But my advice is, as long as you feel like people are actively trying to get it, be as absolutely gracious with them as you can. When I first came out to my Mormon parents, like, I think I was expecting them to get name and pronouns right, like instantly. And I was all spunky and mad about it. Because from my perspective, it's like, oh, I've wasted like 24 years. I want to make up for lost time. But from their perspective, it was like, a bomb being dropped on them or something like that. And I think in hindsight, I wish that, I'd been a little more gracious, but I think ultimately it's going to take time either way. For me, it's like I left the Mormon church, and my parents were upset about that, and we spent 5 years healing from that. And then I was like, oh, by the way, just one other thing, I'm also trans, and then we had to spend kind of 5 years healing from that. So that's the other piece of advice, is like, be gracious, but also be patient. This process of acceptance happens, but it takes time, sadly. But it's time well spent if you value relationships with those people.
That was a really beautiful response. And, just having known you for years now, grace and patience are just absolutely come immediately to my mind. And I think the other thing, though, that you do such a good job of illuminating in your book, and you really brought out in the reading today, was how much chosen family is important in negotiating this too. Like, yes, it is really hard to come out to a conservative community, a conservative family, but chosen family there. I thought you really captured beautifully.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even if your own biological family does eventually come around to you, why not just get two families? Like, a chosen family can help you through difficult times and then just be really great friends to you afterward. and if your own family isn't there for you on the other side, you still have your chosen family to carry you through the rest of your life. And yeah, I think that process is really beautiful.
I have more questions, but Billy, did you want to jump in with one?
Well, yeah, I was going to say the idea of chosen family, I feel like would fit really well with a question that was asked during our class this morning. So there's neighborhoods at Elon, and like there are different living, what are they called? I guess like living learning communities. Yeah, they call them LLCs, living learning communities. And myself and other people are in the Gender and Sexuality LLC. And one of the students asked what they could do, in your opinion, to make their time in the LLC, like surrounded by queer people, feel valuable and like important to them.
I mean, first of all, this sounds amazing. I started off going to college at Brigham Young University, and there are not LGBT LLCs there. So my first response is, I'm jealous. My second response is, it's gonna hit on a theme I've been hitting on: invest in friendships. You know, I think that's my ancient 33-year-old wisdom is, you know, I know when I was younger, it felt like really radical and fun and like young and youthful and vibrant to be queer and do all this stuff that's important. You know, activism and advocacy is important, but what's going to sustain you lifelong are the skills that you develop building lasting friendships with people. That's going to be the real source of beauty in your life beyond college. So the more that you can learn about building great friendships now, the better, I think.
And it's so hard. And so, you know, a lot of our students right now are dealing with, we're still in person. So a number of our students are dealing with being in quarantine. And it's a really hard time to build community. So I also was reminding the students, like, you know, there's a lot of things that like a year from now, hopefully will be possible for you to do together that are just harder now. And I'm really glad that we can have this virtual space here, because this virtual space is something we can do during the pandemic. And I don't know, I was thinking about Billy's question earlier about video games, and thinking about all that we're learning, right, from finding ourselves in virtual spaces now, and what we will want to take back with us. I have some more questions, but I want to not dominate too much. Does anyone else want to jump in, or should I go? Okay. So in your third chapter, Texas Outrageous, which well, I love all the chapters, but I really like Texas Outrageous a lot. I love the way that you incorporate Gloria Anzaldua's work when you go down to McAllen, Texas. I love a lot of things that are happening in this chapter. But in that chapter, the first part of it, when you're in the Texas State Capitol in July 2017, protesting with LGBTQ activists and allies against the special session to pass SB 3, a transphobic bathroom bill that would require people in public schools and government buildings to use the restroom that matched their birth certificate gender markers. Right? We've dealt with a similar legislation in our state, and I wonder, you know, I think that you really beautifully capture in that chapter the spirit of the activists in that space. I love the way that you describe the rotunda and the way that the sound resonates. But I wonder what advice you might have for young activists in North Carolina who are facing similar obstacles.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I hesitate to give advice because I mostly just kind of stand in awe of people who are doing this work. I think you know, sometimes it feels really cool to be a reporter, but then other times it feels like I'm just here tagging along with you all. Like, you're the real, like, you know, like, and that's true. Like, I feel like the niche that I've found for myself is mostly like writing and commenting on activism and advocacy, and just like standing in awe of it as it happens. But I can give, you know what I'll say? I'll say run for office if you're queer, and run for office where you are. I think that is just been an absolutely critical driver of change. Protest is important, but there's this saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. This is something I hear from LGBTQ candidates and politicians all the time, you know, and you see, gosh, it was in Virginia a couple years ago, a transgender woman named Danica Rome became the first transgender woman to be elected and seated to a state legislature. And Danica gets there, and then suddenly anti-trans bills can't get anywhere. Like, there's a difference between passing something that you think is going to affect some nameless, shapeless population of queer people out there, and passing something that would literally affect one of your own colleagues, you know? So yeah, among the pieces of advice I could give, I think one of the most important ones would be, if you feel like running for office could be in your future as an LGBTQ person, go for it, you know? And where we start to see the real change happening is what I'm hearing from, you know, advocacy groups is not just when we get one queer person on a city council or a state legislature or in Congress. It's when you have 2, 3, 4, 8. When you start to build like a little contingent, you know, you get your own little LLC of queer people on a Virginia state legislature and North Carolina state legislature. That I think is going to be a really important bulwark against any sort of federal anti-LGBTQ shenanigans, is to have more state level queer representation.
Absolutely. And I think you're very humble, but I think that the work that you do as a reporter is also a really helpful part, a really important part of protest. I mean, actually, I was thinking about, I'm teaching our former professor, Lynn Huffer's book this semester, Foucault's.
Oh, exciting.
And one of the ideas that Dr. Huffer presents in this book that is so beautiful is this idea of ethical watchkeeping. And she's talking about how, you know, like one of the things that we can do for one another, one of the ways that we can exert or sort of show solidarity is to keep a lookout. And being a reporter is a mode of ethical watchkeeping, I would hazard to say.
I'm going to change my Twitter bio to ethical watchkeeping.
I love it. I'm curious if others have questions. I can ask if others don't, but I don't want to dominate. Yes, please, Libby.
I was just going to ask, kind of dovetailing off of that question. You know, a lot of folks during this time have thought about what activism looks like, and of course, the risks are different. If you're trans, the risk of being incarcerated, being arrested and incarcerated is different. And I wonder if you can speak to that, about how different people might be able to find their place in activism in a way that is not necessarily in the streets.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think about. I have a chronic heart condition, so being in like a big crowd of people was not something I really wanted to do over the summer, outdoors or not. Yeah, I think this is a time when a lot of people are asking themselves what activism looks like, as you mentioned, and I think that would be the most important thing, I think, to take away from it. You know, there are folks who, if you go to a protest and you get arrested, you're going to be incarcerated in a prison that runs counter to your gender identity, you know, or based on your identity, you're going to be more likely to be targeted and arrested. And so the advice that I would give to people is not always like get out in the streets. It's get out in the streets if you want to, if you feel like that's safe for you to do, and you can certainly make a powerful statement with peaceful protests in the streets. But I think this is also a time for people who don't feel comfortable or who can't engage in that form of activism and advocacy to kind of take that step back and say, what is my sphere of influence? Who can I have a conversation with? How can I have those conversations? What do they look like? Does it look like a Zoom call? Does it look like a socially distanced outdoor hangout with folks where we talk about a book or something like that? You know, it can take so many forms. And I think overall, that's something that I was hoping to kind of say with Real Queer America is I feel like our understanding of LGBTQ history is so tied to large public protests and pride events. And for good reason. Like, it's really dramatic to watch, and they have played this absolutely crucial role, especially in 20th century queer history in the United States. But I think what we're seeing now as familial and social acceptance grows is that the conversations that you're having with friends or family members are just as powerful a form of activism and advocacy as showing up en masse in the streets. So those are some, early thoughts.
Thank you. Let's see. I have one question that I'm really eager to ask you, because you ended up addressing it in your comments, in your opening comments, in a way that I didn't quite expect, and so it deepens the question that I wanted to ask you. So I was really interested in and asking for my students as well, thinking about many of the people in our audience right now are WGSS minors. Right? And they are pursuing a minor in WGSS and thinking about what they can do with that minor. And you got a doctorate in this field, and I got a graduate certificate, and often wish that I could have just been in the doctorate my favorite classes were over there. And I think about any thoughts you might have about your writing process, the way that you synthesize theory and sort of the kind of theory that we did or that we were learning with concrete lived experience, I think is really exciting for my students. And I would love to hear any of your thoughts about your writing process and how your degree in gender studies prepared you for journalism.
Yeah. So I remember when, we were in grad school together, you're in these dusty seminar rooms and these big old marble buildings. And I always felt like if we can't make these theories that we're talking about make sense in like 2 sentences, like maybe 2 long sentences, but still 2 sentences that you could talk about with an uncle who doesn't have a college degree, then like what use are these ideas if they're only ever gonna have enough oxygen to survive in this room? So I kind of came out of grad school with a very strong commitment to being sure to take those ideas and sort of translate them and make them accessible, because I found them to be very powerful, both personally and sociopolitically. But I wanted to put them in a context where people could engage with them and find out what they mean, where like, and that was kind of like the tightrope walk of writing the book. Was I wanted it to be something where, if a long-standing student of queer theory picked it up and read it, they would enjoy the application of it. But I also wanted to be something someone could read on a beach who had never even heard of, Judith Butler's name before, and come away feeling like they understood ideas like queer world making, or, queer friendship is a way of life, or like this kind of thing. So yeah, that was a bit of the process. Was I would kind of take a lived experience and a theory that I felt like worked really well thematically for that experience or that chapter. And it was just about toying with the balance of like, how much do I explain and how much do I just kind of explain through, and that was always the better option, just explaining through the experience, braiding in the theory where necessary. In terms of like using a WGSS degree, I mean, we're seeing right now like gender and sexuality are just like huge prisms through which people understand themselves, view the world, take political action, good or bad. The idea of someone making fun of someone for studying women's gender and sexuality studies it's hilarious to me, because it's such a core part of people's identities, and such a powerful way of understanding how people behave as social and political actors, that like it's tremendously beneficial to have that expertise and that perspective right now. So yeah, my hat is off to people who are continuing to study this field, get degrees in it, certificates, minors. Like, this is stuff you need to know, and it's clear when you kind of get that perspective and kind of enter the world, how many people are like hungry to like understand gender and sexuality better in ways that they weren't able to do in a university setting because they didn't go take the WGSS 100 course or that kind of thing. Yeah, sorry, I'm rambling.
No, that was really beautifully put. I mean, and I appreciate your thoughts on, I think it is my hope, and I know it's the hope of some other people who are listening to this right now, who are WGSS minors, and also who are on the executive board of WGSS, including Libby Coiner, who, many of us really hope that WGSS can be a major in the next coming years. It's a minor right now. And I really appreciate you sharing those thoughts, because they help us build up our arguments for how important this field is and the space that it provides. So thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it's gender and sexuality are like the water we live in. It would be like if fish had a university and they made fun of each other for majoring in water studies or something like that. This is a very terrible analogy, but I'm going to stick with it.
I like it. I think it's great. I think it's delightful. Are there other questions from the audience? Well, Dr. Ringelberg likes the analogy too, so we're doing great.
Excellent. More bad analogies.
Can I ask, we just watched, in our WGS class, we watched the documentary Disclosure. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's about trans representation in media. And a couple weeks ago, a popular trans kind of thinker and YouTuber made a statement saying that she wished that people wouldn't transition publicly. Like, she wished that we would just be shipped off to an island with our hormones and then come back in a few years and just look how we want to look. How important is this concept of visible queerness and visible transness to you, and like your work that you do?
I think the sentiment that I align with most is something Laverne Cox has said about being trans. She is a big proponent of the slogan, "Trans is beautiful." And I think that's something she's talked very powerfully about having to overcome, is feeling like, oh, I want to feel beautiful in this way of like people looking at me and not seeing my trans characteristics or my tells and thinking that I'm just beautiful based on cis-normative beauty standards. And Laverne Cox has spoken so beautifully about kind of turning a corner on that and saying, no, like, being trans is beautiful. The parts of me that look trans are beautiful. And that's, I think, a sentiment I really admire and try to align myself with. It's hard, dysphoria is a tough thing to deal with, but I think we're better off in a world where people feel comfortable and valuable and beautiful looking how they look and how they want to look, rather than necessarily feeling like we have to hide.
Sorry, I'm just processing that answer and thinking. I probably have a follow-up question. I'll probably have one.
No, take your time. I would love to keep talking about it.
Yeah, no. I had a conversation with another trans person. I'm getting my top surgery in December, and I had a conversation with another trans person who had gotten theirs and realized that not that they regretted it in any sense of the word, but that they kind of missed having that visible transness, like having breasts and like being obviously a boy with breasts and like having that visible transness. So this idea of celebrating, I think, like the holiness and like the kind of like sacred mentality that comes with being trans is really, really important to me. So I really appreciate that answer.
Yeah. and when I say that, like, I don't mean that like people shouldn't get medical interventions if they don't need them, like, but I, I do mean that, like, whatever you want to do, like, it's like, embrace it and own it.
Thank you.
Well, I have a few questions from students from class today, but I also want to be sure that I'm catching anything in the Q&A. So if you're in the audience and you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. I'll catch them. But let's see, students asked today, so you spoke a little earlier about optimism. Another of my students, who I think is also listening right now, asked today, if you were to take the road trip that you took in 2017, what might you expect to see now different from what you saw in 2017, especially in red states?
Yeah, I mean, right now, like, political polarization tends to be especially exaggerated right before an election. So I'd expect to see more of that. I also think that, like, the pandemic has really radically disrupted our ideas of what empathy and compassion for your fellow person look like in ways that have been very stark across, kind of a conservative liberal divide in these places. And yeah, that's something, I'm in Washington State now, and that's something I notice right away. It's like, you're in the more urban area, mask wearing is common. You're in the more rural area, mask wearing in stores kind of goes out the window despite a state mandate, right? Like, so it's it's something I'm still, like, grappling and dealing with. But I would, if I did this road trip today, still expect to see more of the same, and perhaps even more positive, encouraging developments. But it would, of course, be heightened with that kind of pre-election anxiety. And I think, like, gosh, I hope that after something like a global nationwide pandemic that shuts down the country for a year and a half, that people caring about attacking queer people will feel quaint afterwards. I know that's not the case. Like, homophobia and transphobia run so deep that that project is going to continue and has continued, at a federal level during this, right? But gosh, it's my hope that we can come out of the other side of this and realize that in this nightmarish world where, particles in the air can kill 200,000 plus people, that, like, why should we continue as a country to just continue, like, just beating our heads against the wall of this culture war? That, yeah.
I mean, and I think one thing that your book does, so, I was thinking about this question, and I think I told you earlier today, I was like, Samantha, I really think I'm putting you on the spot. If I ask you how to be optimistic in 2020, I'm like, I would have no idea how to answer that. But what I hear, and what I actually have been reading repeatedly in your book that I find so reassuring, and I really heard again in your opening comments, and maybe you want to speak more to this, but when we pay attention to the local, I think
yeah,
something really interesting in your focus on the local. And, I mean, our students at Elon, who live in Burlington and in Elon, North Carolina, I mean, we are in very much a traditionally conservative county. But, right, there's some really exciting things happening. And I mean, and so I wonder how a focus on the local might help us to be more optimistic.
Yeah, and that's the rub, right? Is, like, after the 2016 election, a lot of news outlets said, oh, we've clearly missed things that are happening outside of New York or DC or LA. So we're going to open up national news bureaus in Kansas City. We're going to start all these full-time reporting positions, that kind of thing. Didn't really kind of bear out that way. I feel like a lot of those promises were pretty hollow. And then with kind of the realities of the journalism industry, we've seen local reporting, local newspapers, local alt weeklies just get absolutely gutted and decimated because of, not to get too inside baseball about it, but no one can quite figure out the advertising model. And then, you know, turning to subscribers is also an option, but people aren't supporting local journalism as much as they should to keep outlets around and keep reporters staffed. So to me, like, so much of the reason for optimism is at the local level. We're just like not even able to access or hear about that information. And writing a book like Real Queer America was this almost kind of desperate attempt to be like, hey, look, this is happening. Like, we don't have, you know, full-time national reporters who are like traveling the country and covering this stuff. So let me like self-fund this thing and like go try to draw some attention to it. But I mean, there is still fantastic quality local journalism. Support it so that you can find out what's happening and feel better about things, because especially with queer issues, that's where you're going to feel optimism, is when you see what people are doing at city councils in West Virginia, more than, you know, turning on CNN and seeing what's happening in DC.
Absolutely. I just threw a link, by the way, in the chat. I just threw a link to follow Samantha Allen's newsletter. And I also want to throw in a link to your podcast.
That's my silly rom-com podcast. But we can make it about queer friendship, because it's me and two queer friends, and we watch rom-coms every week, and we make a case for the character who doesn't get chosen, which I think is a very queer task. We're raising up the rejected and marginalized character. But yeah.
Any lingering questions? Well, I want to thank Samantha so much for her time today. And I'm going to really quick again, you know, I know that my students who are in the audience have already gotten and read this book. But yeah, I really highly recommend it. And I'm just so glad to get to feature my friend, Samantha Allen, here today. So thank you so much. You're getting lots of thanks in the chats.
Hi, chat. Thank you. This was such a pleasure and a joy. Thank you so much for having me. It's a very anxious time right now, and it was just wonderful to come chat with you all. This gives me hope, is just having these kinds of conversations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Billy and Libby and Sos, for joining us in this space. It was lovely to have you here. And so I'm going to go ahead and end our meeting. But thank you so much. And again, everybody, be sure to check out and get your copy of Real Queer America, LGBT Stories in Red States. Thank you so much.